Hey, it's been a little while since I've done one of these, but the reason why I'm doing it is because we just had the big Invictus Gaming huge roster change, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about LPL role swaps and why maybe they're perceived as being so rampant in China, especially in some of the unique aspects of the region that make it transpire. But then maybe also talk a little bit why people have hammered this a little bit too much as a so China thing. First, let's talk a little bit about what exactly happened, just so people have background of why this came out. Invictus Gaming, as a team, have been doing really, really poorly this split. They, if you guys remember, barely made playoffs last split, immediately got out in the first round, but overall they looked surprisingly good for having lost Kakao and moved Kid to the jungle role, and people were surprised by how well Kid transitioned from the AD carry role to the jungle role, and then they were also he was definitely not the worst player. He went from people saying that he was a bottom 2 player on the team to maybe the 3rd best player on the team, because their bottom lane was just not doing well. And they tried out 4 different players in the bottom lane. They had Kitties and Tabe as support. They've had Rain and Time as AD carry, and none of these players really seemed to do the job or make the team look extremely strong. Recently, Save was added back to the roster as a substitute. He was there for a little while before it was announced, I think, as well, but people started to notice he was back on the roster. Save and originally joined Invictus Gaming in 2015 spring with Kakao and Rookie, but of course you can't play through Koreans. He also joined with Fly, right? And he ended up going to Young Glory because Invictus Gaming made the decision to stick with Kakao and Rookie as their starting Korean players. Zatai role swapped to the top lane, and Save was left with this option. He was ultimately benched from Young Glory because they found more success playing with a much more roleplay oriented top laner, and so that's kind of what happened to Save. He was added back to the Invictus Gaming roster recently, and he's been duo queuing with Rookie quite a bit on the Korean server. Now, Invictus Gaming made the decision to swap Rookie from the mid lane position to the AD carry position and put Zatai back in the mid lane position, and then brings Save onto the roster. So already you have a lot of questions because Rookie is definitely, most people undisputedly say he has been the best performing mid laner in the LPL recently, and he's just done a really, really amazing job outplaying a lot of different people, performing really well for IG. People will say he's definitely the MVP of the team. He gets a lot of the resources when they do win. He looks ridiculously good, things like this. So people were really, really skeptical about this. But when you look at the roster change, you assume if they can't find a good AD carry, then it's actually not a terrible one, because you have Zatai. He used to play mid laner, and he used to be a relatively strong mid laner in the LPL, and he has a very do-or-die, need-to-outplay mentality that's not too dissimilar to Rookie's. So you move him to the mid lane, you put Save back in the top lane, who had a good reputation. I still am not 100% sold on Save, but we'll see. I think that he had demonstrated a few champion pool issues, but we'll see how he performs. But he's definitely not a bad player by any means. Then you move your best player to the role that's currently your worst role, and you keep the person you brought on to be the shot caller, who's Tabe. And in Rookie's words, you know, it's Tabe. His voice is very loud, so this is the main reason to have Tabe on the team. Okay, so this roster is actually better than their roster. If you ignore the fact that you're moving Rookie from the mid lane to the AD carry, this roster, in terms of the overall talent level, is better than the old roster. There's actually not a lot of dispute in that regard, assuming that Rookie has the mechanics to be able to play the AD carry role. And of course, since Rookie is he positioned far forward as a mid laner, so it's not going to be something that's super easy for him to transition into, but overall, it's not a terrible idea, assuming they can't find an AD carry. The main question everyone then asks is, why can't they find an AD carry? And where you start to ask the question of, why are role swaps so prevalent in the LPL? Why are these talented players switching roles and staying on the same roster? So let's first go to a little further back and talk about the history of some of these role swaps in the LPL. There have been a lot of teams that have been successful off of a role swap. There's the famous WE role swap of Xiaomei and Weishao switching roles. That's one of the greatest teams of all time that kind of occurred off of that role swap. You have oh my god, debatably the most successful role swap in the history of League of Legends, or the role swapping player, was Razleplasm, who moved from support to jungle to support. But OMG in general, and back to jungle, is a very, very heavy role swapping team. If you watch some of their old VODs from before they were in the LPL, like late 2012, it was very, very frequent that they would change roles. You'd see games where going would be support or things like this, and they would just role swap differently. If you talk to the team, you hear that they used to, in the early years, role swap a lot in scrims so that they have a better understanding of how the map works holistically, and you have different players in other roles. So there's this idea that you get more from the game by being a more versatile player, by being a player that can play a bunch of different roles. And I think as a result, a lot of the mentality towards the game in the LPL is that if you have a good player, this good player can just play the game better than other people. So the assumption is that if you take a good player who looks ridiculously good, you can teach him at one aspect, you can teach him to play a different type of thing. This is why when you see a lot of these really weird talent grabs and roster builds in the LPL, especially in 2015, where people just grabbed these talented Koreans and they said, oh, you can do whatever I want you to, right? You can just fill this role. It's a very different mentality from what I perceive as the Korean one, because when you see Korean players, you have these teams built and this player who becomes very proficient at this one type of play, and the teams are built around this player playing this one type of play, and obviously they're coached to be able to have more dimensions as the meta continues, but you see teams like Samsung White, Samsung Blue, where players like Deft and Ip had very specialized roles, and they got really good at doing these types of things, and then they come over to the LPL and they're sort of forced to play all these different types of things, and this is why they look so impressive, is because they're forced to play all these different types of roles, and they succeed in it. But the LPL just assumes that if you're a good player, you can kind of do that. LPL teams just kind of take someone and do these sorts of things. So a lot of that, I think, comes from the fact that you've had so many successful role swaps in the history of the LPL. There have been successful role swaps in other leagues, but I just think the magnitude overall, yeah, we had Chowster, who went to support, and that was really great, right? Chowster was a player who could play a ridiculous amount of roles, but I think that that's more perceived as an isolated case, where you have a bunch of these history of these really strong teams coming out of role swaps. Kid also initially was a mid laner. He switched to AD carry. That's another strong Chinese team in the history of Chinese League of Legends that became extremely strong after they picked up this talented player and made him swap roles. Tabe used to be an AD carry. Now went to play support. So there are a lot of those in the LPL where you think of the greatest all-time Chinese teams, and they had a role swap at some point. But this is definitely not the only reason why you have the role swaps, right? Because the other thing that is very unique to the LPL is this transfer period setup. As the league kind of progresses, we're seeing stricter transfer period rules in the West and in Korea, but in the LPL for a very long time now, in part because of you have these really, really rich owners who are willing to just buy out these other players. You have strict transfer periods between the spring and summer season and the summer and spring season, and you can only trade players from teams at this time. You can only do contract buyouts during this time. Otherwise, you can only add free agents to the roster. This creates a scenario where usually your best option, if you want to recruit a new player, is to look at a free agent, right? And you look at the solo queue ladder and you pick a player from there, and this becomes a very difficult prospect because you have to teach this player how to play competitively and then hope that they can fit your needs. Whereas with the LPL mentality, you look at your roster and your list of subs and you say, okay, this player has played competitive for a while. We know that he's a good player. We can just make him play AD carry, we can just make him play this role, we can just make him play that, and then he'll be able to, we hope that he'll be able to figure out how to play that role in a competitive setting, already knowing how to play competitively, before, or better than, we can teach this other new player how to play competitively. So I think that this is a decision that has colored a lot of LPL roster moves and why you see a lot of these role swaps. I'm not speaking specifically to Vici Gaming, I'm speaking a lot to, it's because I think the Dandy role swap top was a very different idea, but I think a lot of the Invictus Gaming role swaps have been this thought process, this kind of thinking of kid knows how to play competitively, struggling as an AD carry, but we can teach him to jungle better than we can just grab a random jungler off of the ladder and teach him how to play competitively. Especially because if you look at the AD carries they picked up, Rain, Time, they were high elo AD carries, right, in Korea and China that they picked up, and then they played terrible in a competitive setting. They were not good. Time had that one great game at Worlds, but that was really an isolated instance. He has not been impressive in almost any other game in which he's played, partly because he's known as like this Kalista one trick, right? So I think that this is one of the reasons why they look at buying these players and they look at adding these players, whereas maybe in other leagues, if things aren't working out on your team and another team has a situation where something isn't working out and they want to trade their AD carry to you, or they have an AD carry in the sub, you can approach that team and work out a deal with them during the regular season, in with regulation, of course, but in the LPL you absolutely cannot. Your options are either a free agent player or someone already on your sub roster. This is also why LPL teams will often have extensive sub rosters and players to choose from in case they need more options during the regular season. Next, there are the buyouts in and of themselves, because you can ask, okay, Invictus Gaming have had a while, why didn't they just buy out another AD carry? Why didn't they just do this thing? So some of the reasons why Invictus Gaming have made their roster decisions is because of demands for cost. I think Wang Sitsong in particular, IG's owner, is actually over the years become slightly more frugal as an owner. He's not just going to buy a random player because he can afford it. This is something that he particularly has decided he no longer wants to do. He wants to pay a specific finite price, so he's not going to necessarily compete with these ridiculously high buyouts. He's going to look for free agent players or players he already has on his roster that he feels are loyal to his team that he can play with in this regard. So he's not necessarily going to be the one who's going to buy the ridiculous, like, all-time high UZI buyout. A lot of these buyouts are really high because, first of all, there's a lot of money involved with the streaming platforms and everything else, and teams see these players as investments. They see these players as 5-year investments. They say, okay, we're contracting this player and we're committing to pay him for 5 years. So if you want to take him from us, you have to pay buyout. You have to pay for the loss that we're having for the 5 years that we assume they had this player contracted for this. Also, like, a lot of teams have the mentality, especially OMG, I've talked to them, that we contract a player, we expect the player to stay with the team. Loyalty is a really big thing also. We expect this player to stay with the team and to be a part of the team, and when his playing career is over, we expect him to continue helping the team, to continue being a part of our brand. The marketing aspect, maybe he'll become a manager, maybe he'll become a coach. Maybe he'll continue to stream for us. So I think that there are a lot of these ideas that maybe almost these players will have this lifetime commitment to your team. So that's why the buyouts are ridiculously high in the LPL. So this is also another reason why some of these roster changes can be very difficult. It's not just an issue of, oh, we'll take these teams and we'll consolidate the talent that we have. This is actually much rarer in the LPL because teams with players that they feel are really intrinsic to their brand are not going to necessarily allow them to be bought out so easily. They're going to give incentives to these players to stay, to make them feel like, oh, this is our home. Especially a lot of the Koreans, right? They get comfortable on a team, they find a place to stay. Finally, in China, they get adjusted to it. And in the Chinese environment, where they're not necessarily naturally comfortable, they're not going to necessarily want to move to another team, really. And since LPL teams also see Koreans as part of their brand, they might say, oh, okay, if you want to go back to a Korean team, your buyout's going to be much lower than if you want to go to a different Chinese team, because in China, you're part of our brand. In Korea, you can be part of their brand. It's okay. It's not necessarily a direct competition. I think the thing that needs to be addressed is really terrible scouting. A lot of times, you can find these really talented Chinese players from solo queue if you really take the effort to look and to go. Like, there have been so many junglers in particular that have come out of the LPL recently that you look at the roster and almost think, okay, maybe even Kid back to the AD carry role, and a solo queue jungler would be a better option because there have just been so many successful cases of solo queue junglers recently. In general, I think that LPL teams maybe are not necessarily motivated to look as hard. A lot of the big Dota orgs, for example, are much more occupied with Dota, much more interested in Dota, spend much less attention on the players they want to contract. They might see, like, MVPs or players that do really well on the international stage and say, we want that player. Not all teams have this problem, but I think that there was this video with Mafa on Invictus Gaming where he was talking about how hard it is to find an AD carry. And it's just hilarious because he was making this video and not very much longer PDD, who used to work for IG, just contracted this duo queue Ning and Ming bot lane, and they've done really, really well in LSPL. They did really well in the Demacia Cup against LPL teams, so it's just funny to have that come through. So I think that the scouting effort hasn't been as strong from LPL teams either, in terms of looking at their own existing talent in solo queue, and also even just looking at the Korean ladder, because honestly, who would contract Rain? I have no idea how he looks. Maybe he looks amazing in scrims or something. I have no idea. Also heard this is especially a problem in the LSPL, where teams will just pick up these Korean players, right? And then the Korean players will have gotten really high and accumulated a lot of points on the Korean ladder, but they'll only know how to play a couple of champions that aren't successful, and even successful or even good in the meta. And people won't look in detail or won't look in depth, and they'll just assume that these players can, okay, if you're good at this thing, maybe you can learn these other things. But then there won't necessarily be the support from management when the coaches try to make these players learn other things also. So there are a lot of problems, but I think that in general, when you talk about why some of these role swaps occur in the LPL, there are actually legitimate reasons for it, and things that make the environment unique or make them more in tune with, or think role swaps are a better idea than we might think of in the West. That said, I think that a lot of the reaction to role swaps in LPL has been, oh, that's so China, when there have been so many weird role swaps in other regions. You have expected to ADC very recently. People say, well, that was an extreme circumstance. I think I've already outlined that the IG case is actually a pretty extreme circumstance, too. You've had high role swap to a ridiculous amount of roles. In Korea, you've had a few recent role swaps between, like, support and jungle, so I don't know, I just think it's been a little overblown. It's like, oh, that's so China sort of stereotype, but there are definitely reasons that the LPL is more prone towards lane swapping, and I think some of them are legitimate. Things like bot scouting, maybe not so much, but anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this, or this was somewhat informative for you, so thank you, and I'll see you again. Hey, it's been a little while since I've done one of these, but the reason why I'm doing it is because we just had the big Invictus Gaming huge roster change, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about LPL role swaps, and why maybe they're perceived as being so rampant in China, especially in some of the unique aspects of the region that make it transpire. But then maybe also talk a little bit why people have hammered this a little bit too much as a so China thing. First, let's talk a little bit about what exactly happened, just so people have to maybe the third best player on the team. Because their bottom lane was just not doing well, and they tried out 4 different players in the bottom lane. They had Kitties and Tabe as support, they've had Rain and Time as AD carry, and none of these players really seemed to do the job or make the team look extremely strong. Recently, Save was added back to the roster as a substitute. He was there for a little while before it was announced, I think, as well, but people started to more success playing with a much more roleplay oriented top laner, and so that's kind of what happened to Save. He was added back to the Invictus Gaming roster recently, and he's been duo queuing with Rookie quite a bit on the Korean server. Now, Invictus Gaming made the decision to swap Rookie from the mid lane position to the AD carry position and put Zatai back in the mid lane position. Notice he was back on the roster. Save and originally joined Invictus Gaming in 2015 spring with Kakao and Rookie, but of course you can't play through Koreans. He also joined with Fly, right? And he ended up going to Young Glory because Invictus Gaming made the decision to stick with Kakao and Rookie as their starting Korean players. Zatai role swapped to the top lane, and Save was left with this option. He was ultimately benched from Young Glory because they found background of why this came out. Invictus Gaming, as a team, have been doing really, really poorly this split. They, if you guys remember, barely made playoffs last split, immediately got out in the first round, but overall they looked surprisingly good for having lost Kakao and moved Kid to the jungle role, and people were surprised by how well Kid transitioned from the AD carry role to the jungle role, and then they were also he was definitely not the worst player. He went from people saying that he was a bottom 2 player on the team